He waited in line for 3 hours to apply for a janitor position, unaware that his 8-year-old daughter had already convinced the billionaire CEO to give her daddy the corner office. Before we dive into this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. The last packet of chicken-flavored ramen sat on the counter like a monument to their circumstances. Marcus Williams stared at it through the dim light filtering through their studio apartment's single window, calculating whether the 27 cents in his wallet could stretch to buy milk for Sophie's cereal tomorrow morning. The math was unforgiving, just like everything else in his life had become. "Daddy, I'm not really that hungry," Sophie announced from her makeshift bed on the pull-out couch, though Marcus could hear her stomach rumbling from across their 12 by 15-foot living space. At 8 years old, she had already learned to lie about her needs, a skill no child should master, but one that had become essential in their daily survival. Marcus turned away from the ramen, forcing his face into the cheerful expression he'd perfected over the past 18 months since losing his job at Davidson Construction. "You sure, sweetheart? I could make us both a bowl. We could split it like we did yesterday." "I ate a really big lunch at school," Sophie insisted, pulling her worn blanket up to her chin. The blanket, decorated with faded unicorns, had been a gift from her mother 3 Christmases ago. Marcus watched as his daughter's small fingers traced the familiar pattern, a gesture that never failed to pierce his heart. The truth was, Marcus had eaten nothing since yesterday's shared bowl of instant oatmeal. His body had adjusted to running on empty, though the constant ache in his stomach reminded him that this wasn't sustainable. But Sophie needed the nutrition more than he did. She was growing, learning, her mind developing at a pace that amazed him daily. His own hunger seemed trivial in comparison. As he prepared the single serving of ramen, adding extra water to make it seem more substantial, Marcus's mind drifted to the conversation he'd had with their landlord that morning. Mr. Chen had been patient, more patient than any tenant had a right to expect, but 3 months of partial payments and promises had exhausted even his considerable goodwill. "I understand your situation, Mr. Williams," the elderly Chinese man had said, standing awkwardly in their doorway while Sophie got ready for school. "But I have my own bills to pay." The property taxes alone. He'd handed Marcus a formal eviction notice, his eyes filled with genuine regret. 30 days. I'm sorry. 30 days. Marcus stirred the noodles mechanically, watching the artificial flavoring dissolve into something resembling soup. 30 days to find first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit for a new place. 30 days to find steady work that paid enough to cover housing costs in a city where rent had tripled in the past 5 years. 30 days to perform a miracle. "Daddy?" Sophie's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. "Can you help me with my homework?" Marcus set the bowl aside and moved to the couch, settling beside his daughter as she pulled out a worksheet from her backpack. The backpack itself was a testament to their circumstances, purchased at a thrift store for $3, with a torn zipper that Marcus had mended with duct tape. Yet Sophie carried it with the same pride other children might show for designer accessories. "What are we working on tonight?" he asked, grateful for the distraction from his own troubles. "Math word problems," Sophie replied, spreading the paper between them. "But they're really easy. Want to see?" As Marcus read over her shoulder, he felt the familiar mixture of pride and concern that had become his constant companion. The problems were designed for 4th-grade students, yet Sophie was only in 2nd grade. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had mentioned during their last conference that Sophie was performing 3 grade levels above her peers in mathematics and reading comprehension. "Tommy has 47 marbles," Sophie read aloud. "He gives away 13 marbles to his friends and loses 8 marbles. How many marbles does Tommy have left?" Without hesitation, Sophie wrote 26 in the answer space. Marcus watched her work through the next 3 problems with equal speed and accuracy, her pencil moving confidently across the page. "These are supposed to be challenging?" he asked, amazed, despite having witnessed her abilities countless times. "Not really," Sophie shrugged. I just picture the numbers in my head, and they sort of arrange themselves into the right answer. Is that weird? Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed all day. It's not weird, sweetheart. It's special. You're special. Sophie beamed at the praise, then carefully packed her completed homework back into her battered backpack. As she organized her materials with the methodical precision that characterized everything she did, Marcus marveled at how his daughter had inherited her mother's brilliant mind, along with her warm brown eyes. Sarah had been the intellectual force in their marriage, the one who balanced their checkbook to the penny and could solve complex problems with an ease that had always impressed him. She'd been working toward her nursing degree when Sophie was born, planning to finish once their daughter started school. The car accident had stolen not just their wife and mother, but also their family's potential escape from financial instability. "Daddy, you look sad again," Sophie observed, settling back against the couch cushions. "Are you thinking about Mommy?" The directness of her question caught him off guard, though it shouldn't have. Sophie had always possessed an emotional intelligence that seemed beyond her years, perhaps accelerated by the circumstances that had forced her to grow up too quickly. "A little," Marcus admitted, "but mostly I'm thinking about how proud she would be of you. You're so smart, Sophie, smarter than both of us put together." "I get my smart from Mommy," Sophie agreed matter-of-factly. "But I get my strong from you. That's what Mrs. Rodriguez says. She says some kids get one or the other, but I got both, which makes me lucky." Marcus felt his throat tighten. Lucky. His 8-year-old daughter, living in a cramped studio apartment, wearing second-hand clothes and pretending not to be hungry, considered herself lucky. "Mrs. Rodriguez is right," he managed. "You are absolutely lucky. We both are." As if sensing his need for comfort, Sophie scooted closer and rested her head against his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the streetlights flicker on outside their single window. The apartment building wasn't in the best neighborhood, but it was safe enough, and the elementary school was within walking distance. Small blessings that Marcus tried to focus on when the larger problems seemed overwhelming. His phone buzzed on the counter, and Marcus reluctantly retrieved it, hoping for news about one of the dozen job applications he'd submitted that week. Instead, he found a text from his brother Derek in Arizona. "Hey man, still thinking about that offer. Phoenix construction is booming. You and Sophie could stay with us until you get on your feet." Marcus stared at the message, torn between gratitude and pride. Derek's offer was generous, genuinely meant, and probably their most practical option. But it would mean uprooting Sophie from the only school where she'd thrived, leaving behind the few connections they'd managed to maintain in the city where Sarah was buried. It would mean starting over again, this time as the brother who couldn't make it on his own. "Who's texting?" Sophie asked, though she couldn't see the phone from her position. "Uncle Derek," Marcus replied honestly. "He wants us to come visit." Sophie considered this information with the same serious expression she wore while solving math problems. "Would we live with them?" "Maybe for a little while," Marcus said carefully. "Would you like that?" "I like Uncle Derek and Aunt Maria," Sophie said slowly. "And I like my cousins. But I also like Mrs. Rodriguez, and she says I might get to skip 3rd grade if I keep doing well. Also, what about Mommy's grave? Who would bring her flowers if we moved away?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Every Sunday for the past 2 years, they had visited Sarah's grave in Riverside Cemetery. Sophie would arrange whatever flowers they could afford, sometimes expensive roses when Marcus had picked up day work, more often dandelions she'd gathered from the park. She would tell her mother about school, about her friends, about the books she was reading. It had become their ritual, their way of keeping Sarah present in their lives. "We could still visit," Marcus said, though he knew the logistics would be nearly impossible. "But not every Sunday," Sophie pointed out with devastating accuracy. "And not when I have important things to tell her." Marcus pulled his daughter closer, overwhelmed by her wisdom and his own inadequacy. Here was an 8-year-old child making rational arguments about the importance of maintaining connections with their past, while he struggled to provide the basics for their present. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but Marcus answered anyway, hoping it might be a potential employer. "Marcus Williams?" The voice was brisk, professional. "Yes, this is Marcus. This is Janet Parker from Morrison Electrical. We received your application for the electrician apprentice position." Marcus's heart jumped. Morrison Electrical was one of the larger contractors in the city, and an apprenticeship would provide steady work with the potential for advancement. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for calling. I'm afraid we've decided to go with another candidate," Janet continued without preamble. "Someone with more recent experience, but thank you for your interest." The line went dead before Marcus could respond. He stared at the phone, feeling the familiar sting of rejection. Morrison Electrical had been his most promising lead this week, and the apprenticeship would have been perfect a chance to learn new skills while earning a living wage. "Bad news?" Sophie asked, reading his expression with uncomfortable accuracy. "Just another company that doesn't need me right now," Marcus replied, forcing lightness into his voice. "But there are lots of other companies out there." Sophie nodded seriously, then surprised him by reaching over and patting his arm with adult-like sympathy. "It's okay, Daddy. The right job is still looking for you. It just hasn't found you yet." The simple faith in her voice both comforted and devastated him. How could an 8-year-old maintain such optimism when surrounded by evidence of adult failure? Marcus had been searching for steady work for 18 months, surviving on occasional day labor and rapidly depleting savings. Their circumstances had deteriorated steadily despite his best efforts, yet Sophie continued to believe that things would improve. As if to emphasize the precariousness of their situation, a knock came at the door. Marcus checked the peephole and sighed, recognizing Tommy from the auto shop where his truck was currently being held hostage. "Hey, Marcus," Tommy said when the door opened. The mechanic looked genuinely apologetic, which somehow made the conversation worse. "I hate to bother you at home, but it's been 2 weeks since we talked about the repair bill." "I know," Marcus replied, acutely aware that Sophie was listening from the couch. "I'm still working on getting the money together. The thing is, my boss is asking questions. $1,400 is a lot to have tied up in parts and labor. If you can't cover it by Friday, he's talking about selling the truck to cover our costs." Marcus felt the walls of their small apartment closing in. The truck wasn't worth much, a 15-year-old Ford with over 200,000 miles, but it was their only transportation. Without it, job hunting became nearly impossible in a city with limited public transit. Day labor opportunities, the few that still called him, required the ability to haul tools and materials to various job sites. "I understand," Marcus said, though he had no idea where $1,400 would come from. "I'll figure something out." After Tommy left, Marcus returned to the couch where Sophie was pretending to read one of her library books. The book, he noticed, was about a girl who solved mysteries using advanced mathematics. Even her recreational reading was several grade levels above her age. "Is our truck sick?" Sophie asked without looking up from her book. "It needs some repairs," Marcus admitted, "but Tommy and his team are taking good care of it." "Will it cost a lot of money?" The direct question forced Marcus to confront his impulse to shield her from their financial reality. Sophie was too intelligent and observant to be fooled by vague reassurances, and she'd already demonstrated remarkable maturity in dealing with their circumstances. "More than we have right now," he said honestly. "But I'm working on it." Sophie closed her book and turned to face him fully. "Daddy, I know we don't have much money. I know that's why you give me your food sometimes, and why we moved to this apartment, and why you worry about the bills. I'm not a baby." The matter-of-fact way she laid out their situation was simultaneously heartbreaking and impressive. Marcus realized he'd been underestimating his daughter's understanding of their circumstances in an effort to preserve some vestige of her childhood innocence. "You're right," he acknowledged. "You're not a baby. You're incredibly smart and observant, and you deserve to know what's happening in our family." "So can I help?" Sophie asked. "I could get a job. Mrs. Rodriguez says some kids in other countries work to help their families. I could babysit or clean houses or help people with their math homework." The image of his brilliant 8-year-old daughter working to support them was almost unbearable. "Oh, sweetheart, that's not your job. Kids are supposed to go to school and learn, and play, and dream about their futures. Making money is the grown-up job." "But what if the grown-up needs help?" Sophie persisted. "What if we work together like a team?" Marcus pulled her into a tight hug, overwhelmed by her generous spirit and frustrated by his own limitations. "You already help me more than you know. Every day, just by being yourself, you make everything better." They were interrupted by another knock at the door. This time, Marcus opened it to find Mrs. Chen, their landlord's wife, holding a covered dish that smelled like heaven. "I made too much lo mein," she announced, though Marcus suspected this was a kind fiction. "Would you and Sophie like some? It's just going to go bad if someone doesn't eat it." Marcus's pride warred with his practical need to feed his daughter. Pride lost. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Chen. Sophie loves lo mein." "I heard that," Sophie called from the couch, and Mrs. Chen smiled, the expression transforming her usually serious face. "Smart girl," the elderly woman observed. "She reminds me of my granddaughter in Beijing. Very clever, always asking questions." After Mrs. Chen left, Marcus and Sophie shared the unexpected feast, both eating with genuine appreciation for the first time in days. The noodles were perfectly seasoned, with vegetables and bits of chicken that made their usual ramen seem like cardboard by comparison. "Mrs. Chen is nice," Sophie commented between bites, "even though Mr. Chen has to ask us to move." "They're both nice," Marcus agreed. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions, even when they don't want to. Like when you didn't want to sell Mommy's car but we needed the money for rent?" Marcus nodded, remembering that painful decision from 6 months earlier. Sarah's car had been their backup transportation and their last major asset. Selling it had bought them a few months of stability, but now even that buffer was gone. As they finished their meal, Sophie began clearing the dishes with the automatic helpfulness that had become second nature. She washed their few plates and cups in the tiny kitchenette sink, standing on a step stool to reach the faucet comfortably. "Daddy," she said as she dried the last dish, "do you remember when Mommy used to read us that story about the little engine that could?" "I think I can. I think I can," Marcus recited, remembering Sarah's animated voice, bringing the children's story to life. "Mommy said the important part wasn't that the little engine was the biggest or the strongest," Sophie continued, hanging up the dish towel with careful precision. "She said the important part was that the little engine didn't give up, even when the hill was really steep and heavy." Marcus stared at his daughter, amazed by her ability to find hope and determination in the simplest places. "That's right. Mommy always said persistence was more important than natural talent." "So we're like the little engine," Sophie concluded with the confidence of someone who had solved a complex equation. "We might not be the biggest or the strongest, but we don't give up. And that means we'll make it over the hill eventually." That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep on the pull-out couch, Marcus sat at their small table with his laptop, scrolling through job listings by the light of his phone to save on electricity. The eviction notice lay beside the computer, a white rectangle of ultimatum that seemed to mock his efforts. Construction jobs were scarce, and most required tools he'd been forced to sell months ago. Retail positions paid minimum wage, barely enough to cover their current rent, let alone save for moving expenses. Office jobs required experience he didn't have, or credentials he couldn't afford to obtain. As midnight approached, Marcus found himself on the website for Sterling Enterprises, one of the city's largest corporations. They were advertising a job fair for entry-level positions: janitors, security guards, mailroom clerks. The pay wasn't substantial, but it included health insurance and opportunities for advancement. More importantly, it was steady work with a reputable company. Marcus printed the job fair announcement on their ancient printer, using the last sheet of paper they owned. The event was scheduled for the following Thursday at Sterling's downtown headquarters. He'd need to take the bus since his truck was still impounded, but the application process was open to anyone willing to wait in line. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a spark of genuine hope. Sterling Enterprises was exactly the kind of company that valued hard work and reliability. If he could get his foot in the door, even as a janitor, he could prove himself worthy of advancement. He could provide stability for Sophie, and maybe even save enough to help her develop her extraordinary academic gifts. As he prepared for bed on the small air mattress he'd placed beside Sophie's couch, Marcus allowed himself to imagine a future where his daughter's intelligence could flourish without the constant weight of financial stress. A future where she could focus on learning and growing instead of worrying about whether they'd have enough food or a place to sleep. Looking at Sophie's peaceful face in the dim light from the street, Marcus made a silent promise. Whatever it took, however long the lines or however many rejections he faced, he would find a way to give his daughter the life she deserved. He would be her little engine, persistent and determined, until they finally made it over the hill together. The next morning brought new challenges but also new determination. Marcus woke before dawn, his body automatically responding to the construction worker's schedule he'd maintained for over a decade. Sophie was still sleeping, her mathematics book tucked under her arm like a teddy bear, and Marcus took a moment to appreciate the sight of his daughter at peace. Their morning routine had become a carefully choreographed dance of efficiency. Marcus prepared Sophie's lunch from their dwindling supplies while she got dressed for school. They shared a breakfast of generic cereal with powdered milk, both pretending it tasted as good as the name-brand alternatives they could no longer afford. "I have show and tell today," Sophie announced as she packed her backpack. "I'm going to talk about why prime numbers are special." Marcus smiled, remembering his own second-grade show-and-tell presentations about toy trucks and baseball cards. "Prime numbers, huh? Think your classmates will understand?" "I'll explain it so they can," Sophie replied with complete confidence. "Mrs. Rodriguez says good teachers make hard things seem easy, and I want to be a good teacher." As they walked to Sophie's school, Marcus marveled at his daughter's ability to find joy and purpose despite their circumstances. She greeted her classmates with genuine enthusiasm, helped a younger student tie his shoes, and hugged Mrs. Rodriguez with the warmth of a child who felt valued and supported. "Mr. Williams," Mrs. Rodriguez called as Marcus prepared to leave. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Marcus approached the teacher with the automatic anxiety that had developed around any unexpected conversation with authority figures. In his experience, such talks usually involved problems he couldn't solve or expenses he couldn't afford. "Sophie is remarkable," Mrs. Rodriguez began, and Marcus felt some of his tension ease. "I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've never had a student quite like her. Her mathematical reasoning is beyond anything I've seen at this level." "She gets that from her mother," Marcus replied, pride evident in his voice. "I wanted to discuss some opportunities for advanced students," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "There's a gifted program at the magnet school across town, and several private schools offer scholarships for exceptional students. Sophie would qualify for any of them." Marcus felt his pride deflate into practical concerns. Transportation to a school across town would be impossible without his truck. Private schools, even with scholarships, typically required families to cover various fees and expenses. Most importantly, any change in Sophie's routine would need to wait until their housing situation was resolved. "That sounds wonderful," Marcus said carefully, "but we're dealing with some logistical challenges right now. Maybe we could revisit this in a few months?" Mrs. Rodriguez studied his face with the perceptive eye of someone who had worked with struggling families before. "Of course. But Mr. Williams, please don't let temporary circumstances limit Sophie's permanent potential. She's special, and she deserves every opportunity we can provide." As Marcus walked away from the school, Mrs. Rodriguez's words echoed in his mind. Sophie did deserve every opportunity, and she was depending on him to provide them. The job fair at Sterling Enterprises wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about creating the foundation for his daughter's extraordinary future. He spent the rest of the day preparing for the interview process, researching Sterling Enterprises online at the public library and practicing his responses to common interview questions. By evening, he felt as ready as possible for what might be their last, best chance at stability. When Sophie returned from school, bursting with stories about her successful show-and-tell presentation and the mathematics puzzle Mrs. Rodriguez had given her to solve. Marcus felt his determination solidify into something unbreakable. His daughter was brilliant, kind, and deserving of a future limited only by her own remarkable potential. Whatever happened at the Sterling job fair, Marcus Williams would not let his daughter down. The Sterling Enterprises website glowed on the ancient laptop screen as Marcus scrolled through the job fair announcement for the third time that evening. The corporate headquarters building gleamed in the promotional photos, 42 floors of glass and steel rising from downtown's financial district like a monument to success. The entry-level positions listed seemed almost too good to be true. Starting wages above minimum, full health benefits after 90 days, and opportunities for advancement based on performance rather than connections. "Daddy, what's that building?" Sophie asked, appearing beside his chair with the silent footsteps she'd perfected in their small apartment. She studied the screen with the intense focus she brought to everything that captured her interest. "It's where I'm going to apply for a job tomorrow," Marcus explained, scrolling to the section that detailed the positions available. "They need people for cleaning, security, and mail delivery. Honest work with good benefits." Sophie climbed onto his lap, her slight weight settling against his chest as she read the job descriptions with remarkable comprehension. "It says here, they promote from within," she observed, pointing to a paragraph about career advancement. "That means if you start in one job, you could move up to a better job later." "That's right," Marcus agreed, continually amazed by his daughter's ability to grasp complex concepts. "It's like climbing a ladder. You start on the bottom rung and work your way up." "How high could you climb?" Sophie asked, turning to face him with genuine curiosity. Marcus considered the question seriously. "I don't know, sweetheart. As high as they'll let me, I suppose, as high as I can prove I deserve to go." That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep clutching her library book about a young mathematician who solved crimes, Marcus laid out his interview outfit on the small table that doubled as their dining surface and his workspace. The sight was both hopeful and heartbreaking. A white dress shirt that had seen better days, black slacks with a carefully mended seam, and dress shoes that had been resoled twice but still maintained their basic dignity. The shirt was his biggest concern. He'd purchased it 3 years ago for Sarah's cousin's wedding, back when they could afford new clothes for special occasions. Since then, it had served for every job interview, parent-teacher conference, and formal occasion in their lives. The collar showed wear, and despite his careful maintenance, the fabric had developed a grayish tinge that no amount of bleaching could completely eliminate. Marcus filled a pot with water and set it on their single burner to heat, while he searched for the travel iron he'd bought at a garage sale. The iron was ancient, its cord frayed and repaired with electrical tape, but it still functioned well enough to press clothes when necessary. As steam began rising from the pot, he realized they didn't have an ironing board, another casualty of their downsizing, but the kitchen counter would have to suffice. Spreading a clean towel across the counter's surface, Marcus began the careful process of pressing his interview shirt. Each section required patience and precision, ensuring crisp lines without creating new wrinkles, or worse, scorching the fabric with the temperamental iron. The sleeves demanded particular attention, and Marcus found himself thinking about the hands that would fill them tomorrow, hands that had built houses, poured concrete, and installed electrical systems, now hoping to convince someone they were suitable for pushing a mop or sorting mail. As he worked, Marcus practiced his responses to anticipated interview questions, speaking quietly to avoid waking Sophie. "My name is Marcus Williams, and I'm very interested in joining the Sterling Enterprises team." He paused, adjusting his tone to sound more confident, less desperate. "I have 15 years of experience in construction, which has taught me the value of hard work, attention to detail, and showing up every day ready to do my best." The shirt complete, Marcus moved on to his slacks, carefully pressing each leg and ensuring the creases fell exactly where they should. These pants had been a Christmas gift from Sarah during their second year of marriage, purchased during better times when such gestures felt casual rather than extravagant. Now they represented his entire professional wardrobe, and their condition would be scrutinized by potential employers looking for reasons to dismiss his application. "I understand this position starts at an entry level," he continued his practice session. "But I'm not looking for handouts. I'm looking for opportunity. Give me a chance to prove what I can do, and I'll exceed your expectations." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, the desperate undertone bleeding through despite his efforts to project confidence. Marcus finished ironing and hung the outfit carefully on the shower rod in their tiny bathroom, where the steam from his morning shower would help eliminate any remaining wrinkles. He set his alarm for 5:30 a.m., though he doubted he'd need it. Sleep had become elusive during times of high stress, and tomorrow's job fair represented perhaps their last chance before the eviction notice became a reality. The next morning arrived gray and drizzle-laden, as if the weather itself was conspiring against his hopes. Marcus showered quickly in lukewarm water. Their hot water heater had been acting up for weeks and shaved with meticulous care, ensuring not even a hint of stubble remained. In his experience, unemployed men were often judged more harshly for grooming details that might be overlooked in others. Sophie woke as he was getting dressed, immediately sensing the importance of the day. "You look very handsome, Daddy," she announced, with the authority of someone delivering an official verdict. "Like a businessman on TV." Marcus smiled at his reflection in their small mirror, trying to see himself through his daughter's loving eyes rather than his own critical assessment. The shirt fit well enough, the pants were properly pressed, and his shoes, while worn, were clean and polished. He would never be mistaken for someone born to wealth, but he looked like a man who respected both himself and potential employers enough to make an effort. "Thank you, sweetheart," he replied, adjusting his collar one final time. "Remember, Mrs. Patterson is going to walk you to school this morning and pick you up this afternoon." Mrs. Patterson was their neighbor in 3B. A retired teacher who had offered to help with Sophie's care during Marcus's job search. The arrangement was informal and unpaid. Marcus couldn't afford childcare, but Mrs. Patterson insisted she enjoyed the company and the chance to spend time with such a bright child. "I know," Sophie said, then surprised him by moving to their small closet and retrieving something from behind her box of school supplies. "I made this for you last night." She handed him a folded piece of construction paper, obviously a homemade card. The front featured a drawing of a man in a suit standing in front of a tall building, with "Good luck, Daddy," written in Sophie's careful handwriting. Inside she had written, "You are the best daddy in the world, and any company would be lucky to have you. I believe in you. Love, Sophie." Marcus felt his throat constrict as he read the message, overwhelmed by his daughter's faith in him. 8 years old, facing eviction and daily uncertainty. Yet, she had taken time to create encouragement for his job search. "This is perfect," he managed, slipping the card into his shirt pocket. "I'll carry it with me for good luck." The bus ride downtown took 45 minutes, providing Marcus with time to review the information he'd gathered about Sterling Enterprises. Founded in 1987 by Victoria Sterling, the company had grown from a small consulting firm to a multinational corporation with interests in technology, real estate, and healthcare. The CEO was known for her philanthropy and her company's progressive employment policies, including their commitment to hiring veterans, single parents, and workers from disadvantaged backgrounds. As the bus wound through increasingly affluent neighborhoods, Marcus observed the changes in architecture and atmosphere. The worn apartment buildings and corner stores of his area gave way to renovated brownstones and upscale cafes. Professional people in expensive suits climbed aboard at various stops, their confident bearing and casual conversations about market trends and business meetings highlighting the gulf between their world and his. At 7:45 a.m., the bus deposited Marcus 3 blocks from Sterling Enterprises headquarters. Even from a distance, the building was impressive, a gleaming tower of blue glass and steel that reflected the gray morning sky like a mirror. Corporate logos adorned the lower floors, and well-dressed people streamed in and out of the main entrance with the purposeful energy of those who belonged in such places. Marcus joined the growing crowd of job seekers gathering near a side entrance marked with temporary signs directing applicants to the employment fair. The contrast between the two groups' employees entering the main doors and applicants queuing at the side was stark and intentional. The message was clear: these were different types of people seeking different types of access to the building. The line stretched around the corner and continued down the next block. Marcus counted approximately 200 people ahead of him, with more arriving every minute. The diversity was remarkable: men and women of all ages and ethnicities, united by the shared experience of economic desperation and the hope that sterling enterprises might offer salvation. "Excuse me," Marcus asked the woman in front of him. "Do you know how long they expect this to take?" She turned, revealing a face marked by stress and exhaustion. "I got here at 6:30, and I was already number 180. She replied. "They're only interviewing people until 4 o'clock, so..." She shrugged, leaving the implication hanging. Marcus calculated quickly. If they processed applicants at a rate of 1 every 5 minutes, optimistic, considering the volume, many people in line would never get the chance to interview. The realization that he might wait all day only to be turned away was sobering, but returning home empty-handed wasn't an option. As the morning progressed, the line moved with glacial slowness. Marcus struck up conversations with his fellow applicants, learning their stories and sharing in their collective anxiety. There was Janet, a former office manager whose position had been eliminated when her company downsized. Robert, a veteran struggling to translate his military experience into civilian employment. Maria, a single mother like himself, hoping for stable work that would allow her to support her 3 children. "It's humbling," Robert observed during one of their conversations. 20 years in the Army, multiple deployments, and now I'm begging for a chance to empty wastebaskets. "Honest work is honest work," Marcus replied, though he understood the sentiment. His own construction experience felt increasingly irrelevant in a job market that seemed to value credentials over capabilities. By noon, Marcus had advanced perhaps 50 positions in line. His feet ached in his dress shoes, and hunger gnawed at his stomach. He'd skipped breakfast to save money and time. The drizzle had intensified into steady rain, soaking through his carefully pressed shirt and undermining hours of preparation. Around him, other applicants showed similar signs of wear, their initial optimism dampened by the slow pace and uncomfortable conditions. Next group, called a harried-looking woman with a clipboard, her tone suggesting she'd repeated this phrase hundreds of times already. 20 people, forms ready, ID in hand. Marcus was still 15 people away from reaching the checkpoint. He watched as the selected group filed through the side entrance, their expressions ranging from hopeful to resigned. Some emerged 20 minutes later looking dejected, others seemed cautiously optimistic as they were directed to additional waiting areas. "What are they asking in there?" Marcus inquired when one of the rejected applicants passed by. "Basic stuff," the man replied, shaking his head. "Name, address, previous experience." But I could tell from her face that my address killed my chances. "They see certain zip codes and assume you're not worth the trouble." The observation sent a chill through Marcus. His current address was in one of the city's least desirable neighborhoods, chosen purely for affordability rather than prestige. If employers were using geography as a screening tool, his application might be doomed before the interview even began. At 2:30 p.m., Marcus finally reached the entrance checkpoint. The woman with the clipboard looked him up and down with practiced efficiency, taking in his rain-dampened appearance and worn shoes. "Application and ID," she demanded without looking at his face. Marcus handed over the carefully completed form he'd printed at the library, along with his driver's license. The woman scanned the application quickly, her expression neutral until she reached his address. Marcus watched her eyebrows rise slightly, a subtle reaction that nonetheless felt like a judgment. "Construction worker," she noted, reading from his employment history. "Any office experience?" "No, ma'am, but I'm a quick learner and—" "Security or janitorial would be more appropriate," she interrupted, making a mark on his application. "You'll be directed to the appropriate interviewer." Marcus was handed a number 347 and pointed toward another line inside the building. The lobby was expansive and elegantly appointed, with marble floors and abstract artwork that probably cost more than his annual income. The contrast between the polished interior and the desperate crowd of applicants was jarring, emphasizing the distance between those who worked in buildings like this and those who merely cleaned them. The internal waiting area was organized by job category. Marcus found himself in the janitorial section, surrounded by other men and women whose appearances and backgrounds suggested similar circumstances. The security line consisted mainly of former military personnel and ex-police officers. The mailroom queue was the most diverse, filled with people seeking what many considered the most promising entry-level position. "Number 340, called a voice from behind a temporary partition. Marcus checked his number again, 347, and settled in for another wait. His stomach rumbled audibly, a reminder that he'd consumed nothing but water since the previous evening. The woman beside him, clutching her purse nervously, offered him a granola bar from her supply. "Take it," she insisted when he tried to decline. "We're all in this together." The kindness of the gesture nearly undid him. Here were people struggling with their own poverty and uncertainty, yet still finding ways to support each other. Marcus accepted the granola bar gratefully, savoring each bite as if it were a gourmet meal. "Number 345. 2 numbers away." Marcus straightened his damp shirt and checked his reflection in his phone's black screen. The morning's careful grooming had been largely undone by the rain and stress, but he looked respectable enough. Sophie's card crinkled in his pocket as he shifted position, a reminder of why he was enduring this process. "Number 346. Marcus stood and moved closer to the partition, rehearsing his responses one final time. The applicant ahead of him emerged after just 3 minutes, his dejected expression suggesting the interview had not gone well. Marcus tried not to read too much into the brief duration. Perhaps the man had been an obvious mismatch for the position. "Number 347. Marcus approached the partition, where a middle-aged woman in a business suit sat behind a small table laden with applications and forms. Her expression was professionally neutral, though her eyes held the weariness of someone who had conducted hundreds of similar interviews. A nameplate identified her as Mrs. Henderson, Human Resources Specialist. "Marcus Williams," she read from his application without looking up. "Construction background, no relevant experience for janitorial work." "I've cleaned construction sites and maintained equipment," Marcus replied, trying to inject enthusiasm into his voice. "I understand the importance of maintaining professional environments." Mrs. Henderson made a note on his application, her pen strokes sharp and decisive. "Address is in the Riverside district," she observed, finally meeting his eyes. "That's quite a commute. Reliable transportation?" Marcus hesitated, knowing that admitting his truck was currently impounded would likely end the interview immediately. "I'm working on securing reliable transportation," he said carefully. "In the meantime, I can use public transit." "Public transit doesn't run late enough for our night shift positions, Mrs. Henderson noted, making another mark on his form. "And our day shift starts at 6 a.m. Can you guarantee punctual arrival using buses?" The question felt like a trap. Admitting uncertainty would disqualify him, but making promises he might not be able to keep could lead to termination after hiring. "I'm committed to being here when you need me," Marcus replied. "Whatever it takes." Mrs. Henderson studied him for a long moment, her expression revealing nothing. "Previous salary in construction?" Marcus provided the figure, watching her calculate the substantial pay cut he would be accepting. The number seemed to confirm something in her mind, and not in his favor. "Mr. Williams, I appreciate your interest in Sterling Enterprises," she began, her tone shifting to one Marcus had heard too many times before. "However, given your background and location, I'm not convinced this position would be a good fit. Construction workers often find the adjustment to service industry work challenging, and your commute would be problematic." "Ma'am, please," Marcus interrupted, desperation creeping into his voice, despite his efforts to remain professional. "I need this job. I'm a hard worker. I show up every day, and I'll do whatever you ask me to do. My daughter is depending on me." The mention of his daughter seemed to soften Mrs. Henderson's expression slightly, but her response remained unchanged. "I understand your situation, but Sterling Enterprises has to consider practical factors. Thank you for your time." The dismissal was final. Marcus accepted his application back, noting the "not suitable" stamp now adorning the top corner. As he walked away from the table, he could hear Mrs. Henderson calling the next number, already moving on to the next hopeful applicant. The rejection stung, but it wasn't unexpected. Marcus had faced similar dismissals dozens of times over the past 18 months, each one chipping away at his confidence while strengthening his resolve. He made his way through the lobby toward the exit, passing new arrivals still filled with optimism and determination. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the damage to his appearance was complete. His shirt clung uncomfortably to his back, his shoes squelched with each step, and his carefully styled hair hung limply around his face. Marcus checked his phone and realized he had just enough time to catch the bus home before Sophie returned from school. As he waited at the bus stop, Marcus pulled out Sophie's handmade card and read her message again. "You are the best daddy in the world, and any company would be lucky to have you. I believe in you." The words provided a small measure of comfort in the face of another failure, reminding him that success wasn't measured solely by employment status. The bus ride home gave Marcus time to process the day's events and plan their next steps. The Sterling opportunity was gone, but other possibilities remained. He would update his resume, expand his search radius, and continue the exhausting process of proving his worth to skeptical employers. Tonight, he would help Sophie with her homework, prepare their simple dinner, and maintain the facade of confidence that kept their small family moving forward. But first, he would stop at the corner store and use his last few dollars to buy ingredients for Sophie's favorite pasta dinner. If he was going to deliver disappointing news about the job fair, he could at least soften the blow with a meal that felt like celebration rather than survival. As the bus pulled into his neighborhood, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the window-attired man in rumpled clothes, carrying the weight of responsibility and the sting of rejection. But also a father, returning home to a daughter who believed in him completely, and that faith was worth more than any corporate position could ever be. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities and new challenges. Tonight, he would focus on being the daddy Sophie deserved, regardless of what any interviewer thought about his qualifications or his address. Every afternoon at 3:15, while other children rushed toward waiting parents or climbed aboard yellow school buses, Sophie Williams walked the 6 blocks from Lincoln Elementary to the downtown branch of the public library. She had been making this journey for 3 weeks now, ever since she'd overheard Mrs. Patterson telling her neighbor that Marcus spent his days pounding the pavement, looking for work that just isn't there. The phrase had stuck with Sophie, creating an image of her father literally striking concrete with his fists while mysterious forces conspired to hide employment opportunities from him. The absurdity of the mental picture had made her giggle at first, but the underlying message was clear. Her daddy needed help, and the grown-ups didn't seem to have any solutions. Sophie had always been a frequent library visitor, but these recent trips were different. Instead of gravitating toward the children's section with its colorful picture books and easy readers, she headed straight for the computer terminals in the adult reference area. The librarians had grown accustomed to the small girl with the serious expression who typed with surprising speed and never needed help navigating the internet. "Researching another science project?" asked Mrs. Kim, the reference librarian, as Sophie settled at her usual terminal. "Something like that," Sophie replied, which was technically true. She was conducting research, though the subject matter had nothing to do with her second-grade curriculum. Sophie opened a new browser window and typed Sterling Enterprises into the search bar. She had memorized the company name from watching her father prepare for the job fair, carefully noting his disappointment when he returned home with rain-soaked clothes and defeated posture. The official company website, loaded with its sleek blue and silver design, corporate photos of smiling employees, and promotional language about innovation and excellence. But Sophie was less interested in the marketing materials than in the About Us section, particularly the biographical information about Victoria Sterling, the company's founder and CEO. She had discovered this section during her first library visit, and the story she found there had captivated her analytical mind. Victoria Sterling had been born Victoria Martinez in a small Texas town, the daughter of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. When Victoria was 9, just 1 year older than Sophie was, her mother died in a factory accident, leaving her to be raised by an elderly grandmother who spoke limited English. Despite these challenges, Victoria had excelled academically, earning scholarships that carried her through high school, college, and eventually business school. The parallels to Sophie's own situation were impossible to ignore. Both had lost a parent at a young age. Both were being raised by people who loved them but struggled financially. Both possessed intelligence that set them apart from their peers. The difference was that Victoria Sterling had somehow transformed her circumstances into extraordinary success, while Sophie and her father remained trapped in a cycle of rejection and diminishing resources. Sophie scrolled through article after article about Victoria Sterling's rise from poverty to prominence. Business magazines praised her innovative approaches to corporate culture. Newspaper profiles highlighted her philanthropic efforts, particularly her foundation's work providing scholarships to children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Most intriguingly, several interviews mentioned her practice of personally reading letters from job applicants who had been rejected through normal channels. "I remember what it felt like to be overlooked," Victoria had told Forbes magazine in a recent interview. "Sometimes the best people never make it past the first round of screening because they don't fit conventional expectations. I try to look beyond resumes and see the person underneath." Sophie printed this article, along with several others, using the nickel-per-page service that represented a significant expense from her modest allowance. She folded the papers carefully and tucked them into her backpack, adding to the growing collection of research materials she had assembled over the past 3 weeks. The idea had been forming gradually, like a mathematical proof working itself out in her mind. If Victoria Sterling made decisions based on personal understanding rather than corporate protocols, and if she specifically sought out people who had been overlooked by conventional processes, then perhaps there was a way to bypass the system that had rejected her father so repeatedly. Sophie understood that her daddy was exceptional, even if the grown-ups conducting interviews couldn't see it. He was kind, hard-working, intelligent, and devoted to her welfare above all else. The problem wasn't his qualifications or character, it was that he didn't know how to present himself in ways that corporate recruiters valued. He answered questions honestly when strategic responses would be more effective. He admitted his limitations instead of emphasizing his potential. He wore his desperation like a visible burden, which made employers uncomfortable. But Sophie could see her father the way Victoria Sterling might see him as someone whose circumstances obscured his true value, someone who deserved consideration beyond the narrow criteria used by Human Resources Department. On Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week after Marcus's disappointing experience at the Sterling job fair, Sophie sat at her usual computer terminal with a fresh sense of purpose. She opened a word processing program and began typing, her small fingers moving across the keyboard with unusual deliberation. "Dear Miss Sterling," she began, then paused to consider her approach. The letter needed to be sophisticated enough to be taken seriously, yet authentic enough to convey genuine emotion. It needed to provide information about her father's qualifications without sounding like a standard resume. Most importantly, it needed to help Victoria Sterling see Marcus Williams as a person rather than just another application. Sophie began again, drawing on the extensive vocabulary she had developed through voracious reading and her natural gift for expressing complex ideas simply. "Dear Miss Sterling, my name is Sophie Williams, and I am 8 years old. I read about your company and about you in magazine articles at the library, and I think you might understand why I am writing this letter. My daddy's name is Marcus Williams, and he tried to get a job at your company last week. The lady who interviewed him said he wasn't suitable, but I think she was wrong. I think she just didn't know how to see what makes my daddy special. You probably get a lot of letters from people who want jobs, but I hope you will read this one because I think we have something in common. I read that your mommy died when you were 9 years old, and my mommy died when I was 6. I read that you were raised by your grandmother who didn't have much money, and my daddy and I don't have much money either. But you became successful anyway, and I think my daddy could too if someone gave him a chance. My daddy worked in construction for 15 years before his company went out of business. He is very good at building things and fixing things and making sure everything is done exactly right. He taught me how to measure angles and calculate areas when we built a bookshelf for our apartment. He can look at a problem and figure out 3 different ways to solve it. When our sink was broken, he fixed it with just some tape and a piece of wire, and it still works perfectly. But the best thing about my daddy is how much he loves me. When Mommy died, he could have sent me to live with relatives who had more money, but he kept me with him because he said families stick together no matter what. When we had to move to a smaller apartment, he let me keep all my books, even though they took up a lot of space. When we don't have much food, he always makes sure I eat first. He helps me with my homework every night, even when he is tired from looking for work all day. Mrs. Rodriguez, my teacher, says I am very smart for my age. I can do mathematics problems that 4th graders find difficult, and I read books that are written for middle school students. But my daddy is smart too, in different ways. He taught me that being smart isn't just about knowing facts from books. It's about figuring out how to solve problems and help people and keep trying when things are hard. I think maybe the lady who interviewed my daddy was looking for the wrong things. Maybe she wanted someone who had fancy clothes and an expensive car and experience working in offices. My daddy doesn't have those things, but he has something better. He has a heart that doesn't give up, and hands that can fix anything, and a mind that can learn whatever you need him to know. We really need this job, Miss Sterling. We got a notice that says we have to move out of our apartment in 3 weeks, and my daddy's truck is broken, so he can't get to construction jobs, even when he finds them. I know you are very busy being the CEO of such a big company, but I wondered if maybe you could give my daddy another chance. Not because you feel sorry for us, but because I think he could be exactly the kind of worker you are looking for. I read in one of your interviews that you like to look beyond resumes and see the person underneath. If you could see my daddy the way I see him, I know you would want him to work for your company. Thank you for reading my letter. I hope you have a very nice day. Sincerely, Sophie Williams. Sophie read through the letter 3 times, making small corrections and adjustments. She wanted the tone to be respectful but not overly formal, personal but not presumptuous. The content needed to provide enough information about her father's qualifications while emphasizing the qualities that made him special: his character, dedication, and problem-solving abilities. Satisfied with the final version, Sophie printed the letter on the library's premium paper, which cost 15 cents but looked more professional than the standard copy paper. She folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope she had purchased at the dollar store, addressing it in her neatest handwriting to Ms. Victoria Sterling, Chief Executive Officer, Sterling Enterprises. The challenge now was delivery. Sophie had researched the company's mailing address, but sending the letter through regular mail seemed inadequate. Important letters could get lost in corporate mailrooms or filtered out by assistants who were trained to handle routine correspondence. If Victoria Sterling truly read letters from overlooked applicants, there had to be a more direct way to reach her. Sophie spent the remainder of her library time researching Sterling Enterprises' corporate headquarters, studying building directories and employee interviews for clues about the executive office's location and accessibility. She learned that Victoria Sterling's office was on the 41st floor, that she typically arrived at work by 7:30 a.m. and often stayed past 8:00 p.m., and that she was known for walking through different departments to stay connected with employees at all levels. More importantly, Sophie discovered that Sterling Enterprises offered public tours of their corporate headquarters every Tuesday and Thursday at 2:00 p.m. The tours were designed to showcase the company's innovative workplace design and commitment to transparency, allowing visitors to see selected areas of the building, including the executive floors. The next Tuesday, Sophie made a decision that would have terrified her father if he had known about it. Instead of taking the bus home after school, she walked the 16 blocks to Sterling Enterprises' downtown headquarters, arriving just as the 2:00 p.m. tour was beginning to gather in the lobby. The tour group consisted of approximately 20 college students researching potential employers, business professionals from other companies, and a few retirees who seemed to enjoy corporate tours as a form of entertainment. Sophie, at 8 years old and carrying a small backpack, stood out immediately among the adults. "Are you lost, sweetie?" asked the tour guide, a cheerful woman in her 30s wearing a Sterling Enterprises polo shirt. "I'm here for the tour," Sophie replied, with the confidence she had practiced during the walk downtown. "My school is doing a project about successful businesses, and I chose Sterling Enterprises because of Ms. Sterling's inspiring story." The explanation was truthful, if incomplete. Sophie was indeed studying Sterling Enterprises, though not for any school assignment. The tour guide seemed charmed by her enthusiasm and academic purpose, making a note on her clipboard without requesting additional verification. "Well, aren't you ambitious?" the guide exclaimed. "I think Miss Sterling would be delighted to know that students your age are learning about leadership and entrepreneurship. What's your name?" "Sophie Williams," she replied, pleased that her research had provided the perfect cover story. The tour began in the lobby with an overview of the company's history and values. Sophie listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that impressed both the guide and her fellow visitors. As they moved through various departments: customer service, marketing, human resources, Sophie carefully observed the building's layout and security procedures. The executive floors required special elevator access, but tour groups were permitted to visit the 39th floor, which housed the executive conference rooms and offered panoramic views of the city. From there, Sophie learned, the CEO's office was just 2 floors above. "Miss Sterling isn't in the building today," the tour guide mentioned as they admired the view from the conference room. "She's attending a board meeting across town, but this is where she holds her weekly leadership meetings with department heads." Sophie nodded politely while calculating the implications. If Victoria Sterling was out of the building, direct delivery of her letter would be impossible today. But the tour had provided valuable intelligence about the building's layout and the executive floor's accessibility. As the tour concluded in the lobby gift shop, Sophie approached the guide with her most innocent expression. "Thank you so much for the wonderful tour. I learned so much for my project. Is there any way I could leave a thank you note for Miss Sterling? I'd love for her to know how inspiring her story is to young students." The guide's face lit up with professional enthusiasm. "What a thoughtful idea. I'd be happy to make sure she receives it. We have a special delivery system for letters addressed to executive leadership." Sophie handed over her carefully prepared envelope, watching as the guide placed it in a folder marked Executive Correspondence. The letter would likely be screened by assistants before reaching Victoria Sterling, but it was a start-away to get her message into the corporate system without relying on standard mail delivery. "She'll be so pleased to hear from such a bright young lady," the guide assured her. "Students like you give us hope for the future of business leadership." Sophie thanked her again and made her way toward the exit, but instead of leaving immediately, she lingered in the lobby, observing the flow of employees and visitors. She noted which elevators required keycard access, where security guards were positioned, and how the reception desk managed visitor credentials. Most importantly, she noticed that employees entering and leaving the building moved with the casual confidence of people who belonged there. If she could somehow blend in with that flow, perhaps during shift changes when traffic was heaviest, she might be able to access areas that were off-limits to tour groups. The idea was audacious and probably impossible for an 8-year-old to execute successfully. But Sophie had inherited her mother's analytical mind and her father's determination, a combination that made her unwilling to accept conventional limitations. Over the next 3 days, Sophie conducted additional reconnaissance missions to Sterling Enterprises. She arrived at different times: morning, lunch hour, early evening, studying the patterns of employee movement and identifying potential opportunities. She learned that maintenance staff often entered through a side entrance that seemed less heavily monitored. She observed that employees frequently held doors for each other even for people they didn't recognize, as part of the company's culture of courtesy. Most significantly, she discovered that Victoria Sterling typically returned from lunch meetings around 2:30 p.m. on Thursdays, entering through the main lobby and taking a private elevator directly to the executive floors. On Thursday morning, Sophie made the most important decision of her young life. She packed her letter in a manila envelope along with a folder containing her research materials about the company. She wore her best dressa navy blue outfit her father had bought for school picture day and carried herself with the poise of someone much older. At 2:15 p.m., Sophie positioned herself in the lobby's seating area, pretending to read a book while watching for Victoria Sterling's arrival. She had studied enough photographs to recognize the CEO immediately. A woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair, typically dressed in elegant but understated business attire. At precisely 2:28 p.m., Victoria Sterling entered the lobby, moving with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to managing time efficiently. She was accompanied by two assistants who flanked her like protective guards, handling phone calls and reviewing schedules as they walked. Sophie stood and approached the group with the fearless directness that only children possess. "Excuse me, Miss Sterling?" The CEO stopped, surprised to be addressed by a child in her corporate headquarters. Her assistants immediately moved to intercept, their professional instincts triggered by the unexpected interaction. "I'm sorry, but Miss Sterling doesn't have time for," one assistant began. "It's all right, Jennifer," Victoria interrupted, studying Sophie with curious eyes. "I always have time for young entrepreneurs. How can I help you?" Sophie had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but facing the actual person she had researched so extensively still felt surreal. Victoria Sterling was smaller than she had appeared in photographs, but her presence was commanding the bearing of someone who had built an empire through intelligence and determination. "My name is Sophie Williams," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I wrote you a letter about my daddy, but I wanted to make sure you actually got to read it yourself instead of having it screened by other people." Victoria's eyebrows rose with interest and amusement. "That's very direct of you, Sophie. What makes you think I need to read this letter personally?" "Because you understand what it's like to be overlooked," Sophie replied, drawing on the research that had led her to this moment. "I read about how you grew up poor and how people didn't expect you to succeed. My daddy is like that too. He's really good at his job, but people don't see it because he doesn't look like what they expect." The sincerity in Sophie's voice seemed to penetrate Victoria's professional demeanor. She glanced at her assistants, who were checking their watches and sending silent signals about her next appointment. "Jennifer, please, reschedule my 2:45, Victoria said, making a decision that would change two lives forever. "Sophie, would you like to come up to my office and tell me more about your daddy?" The assistants exchanged glances of surprise, but efficiently began rearranging the afternoon schedule as Victoria guided Sophie toward the private elevator. As they rose toward the 41st floor, Sophie felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She had achieved the impossible private audience with one of the most powerful women in the business world. Victoria Sterling's office was both impressive and surprisingly warm, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic city views, but also personal touches that revealed the woman behind the corporate title. Family photographs sat on her desk, alongside business awards. Bookshelves contained both management texts and novels. A small, succulent garden thrived near the windows, suggesting someone who nurtured growth in unexpected places. "Please, have a seat," Victoria said, gesturing toward a comfortable chair across from her desk. "Now, tell me about this letter and your daddy." Sophie handed over the manila envelope, watching as Victoria read her carefully crafted message. The CEO's expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine engagement as she absorbed the letter's contents. "This is beautifully written, Sophie," Victoria said when she finished. "You have quite a gift for communication. But I'm curious, does your father know you're here?" Sophie shook her head honestly. "He thinks I'm at the library doing homework. He doesn't know I've been researching your company or that I wrote the letter. He would probably be upset if he knew, because he doesn't like asking for help." "I see," Victoria mused, studying Sophie with renewed interest. "So this is entirely your initiative?" "Yes, ma'am. I just thought if you could meet my daddy and see how special he is, maybe you'd understand why the lady at the job fair was wrong about him not being suitable." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the letter's contents but the extraordinary courage and intelligence required for an 8-year-old to orchestrate such a meeting. Finally, she spoke. "Sophie, what you've done today, researching my background, writing this letter, finding a way to reach me directly, that shows remarkable initiative and strategic thinking. But more than that, it shows how much you love your father." "He's the best daddy in the whole world," Sophie replied with absolute conviction. "He just needs someone to give him a chance to prove it." Victoria Sterling smiled, recognizing in this remarkable child an echo of her own determined younger self, the girl who had refused to accept limitations others tried to impose, who had found ways to make herself heard despite systemic obstacles. "Well then," Victoria said, reaching for her phone, "I think it's time I met this exceptional father of yours." Victoria Sterling had been expecting Jennifer to brief her about the quarterly projections when the elevator doors opened to reveal an 8-year-old girl in a navy blue dress, standing with the poise of someone 3 times her age. The child's dark eyes held an intelligence that was immediately recognizable to someone who had spent decades identifying exceptional talent, but finding such capability in someone barely tall enough to reach the elevator buttons was unprecedented in Victoria's corporate experience. "Please, have a seat," Victoria said, gesturing toward the chair across from her mahogany desk, a piece that had cost more than most families spent on housing in a year. She watched as Sophie settled herself carefully, placing a manila envelope on her lap and folding her small hands with deliberate precision. The child's composure was remarkable, showing none of the nervousness Victoria would have expected from someone her age in such intimidating surroundings. "Now, tell me about this letter and your daddy," Victoria prompted, accepting the envelope Sophie offered. The paper was standard office stock, but the handwriting was meticulously neat, each letter formed with the careful attention of someone who understood that presentation mattered. As Victoria read, her initial curiosity transformed into something deeper and more complex. The letter was extraordinary not just for its emotional content, but for its sophisticated understanding of business communication. This child had researched Victoria's background, identified relevant parallels to her own situation, and crafted an argument that was both personal and professional. More importantly, she had demonstrated initiative that most adult job seekers never mustered. "This is beautifully written, Sophie," Victoria said when she finished reading, though the words felt inadequate to express her amazement. "You have quite a gift for communication. But I'm curious, does your father know you're here?" Sophie shook her head with refreshing honesty. "He thinks I'm at the library doing homework. He doesn't know I've been researching your company or that I wrote the letter. He would probably be upset if he knew, because he doesn't like asking for help." Victoria recognized this trait immediately, the pride that made poverty more bearable, but also more persistent. She had seen it in her own mother, who had worked 3 jobs rather than accept charity, and in herself during the early years when admitting need felt like admitting failure. "I see," Victoria mused, studying Sophie with renewed interest. "So, this is entirely your initiative?" "Yes, ma'am. I just thought if you could meet my daddy and see how special he is, maybe you'd understand why the lady at the job fair was wrong about him not being suitable." The word unsuitable hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Victoria understood better than most. She had been deemed unsuitable countless times during her own rise: too young, too female, too ethnic, too aggressive, too different from the established patterns of success. The memory of those rejections, even decades later, could still produce a flash of anger at the arbitrary nature of corporate gatekeeping. "Tell me about your daddy, Sophie," Victoria said, leaning back in her chair and giving the child her full attention. "Not what's in the letter, but what makes him special to you." Sophie's face lit up with the pure joy of someone given permission to talk about their favorite subject. "My daddy can fix anything," she began, her voice gaining confidence as she warmed to the topic. "When our refrigerator stopped working, and we couldn't afford to call a repairman, he took it apart and figured out that one tiny wire was loose. He fixed it with a paperclip and some tape, and it's been working perfectly ever since. Victoria found herself smiling at the image of a construction worker performing appliance surgery with office supplies. That sounds like creative problem solving. That's what I told him, Sophie exclaimed, delighted to find someone who understood her perspective. He doesn't just follow instruction, she thinks about why things work and how to make them better. Like when we built my bookshelf, he showed me how to calculate the weight distribution so it wouldn't tip over, even though the instructions didn't explain any of that. He taught you engineering principles while building furniture? Victoria asked, intrigued by this glimpse into their father-daughter relationship. He teaches me lots of things, Sophie continued enthusiastically. Math and science and how to use tools safely. But he also teaches me important things like why it's good to help people, even when you don't get anything back, and why telling the truth is better than saying what people want to hear, even when it's harder. Victoria felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the recognition of someone raising a child with the same values that had shaped her own character. Her grandmother had taught similar lessons during those difficult years after her mother's death, emphasizing integrity and compassion even when the world seemed to reward neither. It sounds like your father is an excellent teacher, Victoria observed. What else does he do well? Sophie considered the question seriously, as though Victoria had asked her to solve a complex mathematical equation. He never gives up, she finally said. Even when things are really hard and he's tired and worried, he keeps trying. Like when Mommy died and everyone said maybe I should go live with my aunt and uncle because they have more money. Daddy said families stick together no matter what, and he figured out how to take care of me by himself. The matter-of-fact way Sophie described this life-altering decision revealed both her maturity and her father's character. Victoria knew from experience how difficult it must have been for a single man to raise a young child while grieving his wife's death and facing financial challenges. That was a big responsibility for him to take on, Victoria said gently. I know, Sophie replied, her expression growing more serious. Sometimes I hear him crying at night when he thinks I'm asleep. Not because he's sad about keeping me, but because he worries he's not giving me everything I need, but he's wrong about that. He gives me the most important thing, which is love that never runs out. Victoria felt her professional composure wavering in the face of such uncomplicated wisdom. This child understood emotional security in ways that many adults never grasped, recognizing that material limitations couldn't diminish the value of unwavering devotion. Sophie, Victoria said carefully, I can see how much you love your father and how much he loves you. But what makes you think I can help with his job situation? Sophie reached into her manila envelope and withdrew a second Documenta handmade creation that immediately captured Victoria's attention. The paper was construction paper, the kind used in elementary school art projects, but the content was unlike anything Victoria had ever seen in her decades of corporate experience. I made this for you, Sophie announced, unfolding what appeared to be a resume created entirely with crayons, colored pencils, and markers. I know it's not like the resumes grown-ups usually make, but I thought it might help you understand my daddy better than those boring lists of jobs and dates. Victoria accepted the document with the reverence it deserved, immediately recognizing that she was holding something unprecedented, but a child's artistic interpretation of her father's professional qualifications. The resume was divided into colorful sections, each illustrating different aspects of Marcus Williams's capabilities and character. At the top, Sophie had drawn a portrait of her father in work clothes, complete with a hard hat and tool belt. The figure was smiling and had muscular arms that suggested strength and capability. Below the portrait, in Sophie's careful handwriting, was the title, Marcus Williams, the best daddy and worker in the world. The first section was labeled Building Things and featured drawings of houses, bridges, and skyscrapers in various stages of construction. Stick figures representing her father were shown operating machinery, carrying materials, and directing other workers. Small notes in crayon explained. Daddy built 47 houses and 12 office buildings and 3 bridges. He never had any accidents because he always follows safety rules. Victoria studied the drawings with growing fascination. Despite their childish execution, they revealed sophisticated understanding of construction processes and project management. Sophie had clearly absorbed complex information about her father's work and translated it into visual form with remarkable accuracy. The second section, titled Fixing Problems, showed before and after illustrations of various repair scenarios. A broken sink became functional again. A car with smoke coming from its engine was restored to health. A wobbly table was stabilized with careful adjustments. Each drawing included explanatory text. Daddy can look at broken things and figure out what's wrong and how to make them work again. He says every problem has a solution if you think about it the right way. This is extraordinary, Victoria murmured, genuinely amazed by the child's creativity and insight. Did your father help you make this? No, ma'am, Sophie replied proudly. He doesn't know about it. I made it by myself by remembering all the things he taught me and all the times I watched him work. Do you want to see the rest? Victoria nodded, completely absorbed in this unique presentation. The third section was labeled Teaching Sophie and featured drawings of father and daughter engaged in various learning activities. Mathematical equations floated around their heads, like thought bubbles. Tools were arranged to demonstrate proper usage techniques. Books were stacked to represent their evening reading sessions. Daddy says the most important thing about being smart isn't knowing all the answers. Sophie had written in the margin. It's knowing how to find the answers and how to teach other people what you learned. The fourth section, titled Taking Care of Family, showed domestic scenes that tugged at Victoria's heart. Sophie had drawn her father cooking dinner, helping with homework, braiding her hair and tucking her into bed. One particularly poignant illustration showed him holding a smaller figure while raindrops fell around them, with the caption, "When I'm sad or scared, Daddy makes everything better just by hugging me." But it was the final section that nearly undid Victoria's professional composure entirely, labeled Dreams for the Future. It featured drawings of father and daughter in various aspirational scenarios. Sophie had illustrated herself in a graduation cap receiving a diploma while her father watched proudly from the audience. Another drawing showed them in a larger apartment, with separate bedrooms and a kitchen table big enough for homework projects. The final image depicted her father in a business suit, carrying a briefcase and smiling, with the caption, "Someday Daddy will have a job that makes him happy and proud, and he won't have to worry about taking care of me anymore." Victoria set the homemade resume down carefully, taking a moment to process the emotional impact of what she had just seen. In 30 years of business leadership, she had reviewed thousands of professional documents, but none had ever moved her the way this child's artistic testament to her father's character had. "Sophie," she said, her voice slightly unsteady, "this is the most compelling resume I've ever seen. You've shown me things about your father that no traditional application could convey." "Really?" Sophie asked, her face brightening with hope. "Do you think it helps you understand why he would be good for your company?" Victoria considered the question seriously, recognizing that her answer would determine the trajectory of this conversation and possibly the lives of two remarkable people. "Yes," she said finally. "I think it helps me understand that your father possesses qualities that are far more valuable than what most companies look for in employees." "What kinds of qualities?" Sophie pressed, sensing an opportunity to strengthen her argument. "Problem-solving ability," Victoria began, counting on her fingers as she spoke. "Dedication to excellence, capacity for learning and teaching others. Loyalty and reliability. Most importantly, the kind of character that makes someone trustworthy with important responsibilities." Sophie nodded sagely, as though Victoria had confirmed conclusions she had already reached through her own analysis. "That's exactly what I think too. So why don't the people who do hiring see those things?" The question struck Victoria as remarkably sophisticated for someone Sophie's age, but it also highlighted a fundamental problem with corporate recruiting practices. "Because," Victoria replied honestly, Many companies focus on credentials and experience rather than character and potential. They want proof that someone has already succeeded in similar roles, rather than evaluating whether they have the capacity to succeed in new ones. "But that doesn't make sense," Sophie protested, with the logical directness of childhood. "How can anyone get experience if no one will give them a chance to learn?" Victoria laughed, despite herself, delighted by the child's ability to identify circular reasoning that plagued entire industries. "You're absolutely right, Sophie. It's a system that often prevents exactly the kind of people we should be hiring from getting opportunities to prove themselves." "So you could change that if you wanted to," Sophie observed, her tone suggesting this was a statement rather than a question. "Because you're the CEO, which means you make the important decisions." The simplicity of the logic was both amusing and challenging. Victoria had built her career on identifying inefficiencies and implementing solutions, yet she had somehow accepted the conventional wisdom that entry-level hiring should be handled by human resources departments using standardized criteria. "You make an excellent point," Victoria acknowledged. "As CEO, I do have the authority to modify our hiring practices." Sophie leaned forward in her chair, sensing that the conversation was reaching a crucial moment. "Does that mean you might give my daddy another chance?" Victoria studied the child's hopeful expression, seeing in it an echo of her own younger self, the girl who had refused to accept limitations others tried to impose, who had found ways to make herself heard despite systemic obstacles. The parallels between their situations were undeniable. Both had lost a parent early, both had been raised by people who loved them but struggled financially. Both possessed intelligence that set them apart from their peers. But there was something else in Sophie's story that resonated even more deeply. Victoria recognized the particular kind of desperation that came from watching someone you loved being repeatedly rejected for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual capabilities. She remembered the frustration of seeing her grandmother dismissed by employers who couldn't see past her accent and limited English, despite her extraordinary work ethic and natural intelligence. "Sophie," Victoria said slowly, "I want to ask you something important. If I were to offer your father a position with our company, what do you think he would say?" Sophie considered the question with the same serious attention she had given all of Victoria's previous inquiries. "I think he would be happy," she replied carefully, "but also scared." "Scared? Why?" "Because he's been rejected so many times that he's starting to think maybe there really is something wrong with him," Sophie explained, with heartbreaking insight. "He tries to hide it from me, but I can tell he's losing confidence. He might think you're just feeling sorry for us, which would make him too proud to accept help." Victoria nodded, understanding the psychological dynamic Sophie had identified. Pride could be both a strength and a vulnerability, particularly for people who had experienced repeated failures through no fault of their own. "What if," Victoria proposed, "we approach this differently? What if, instead of offering your father charity, we offered him an opportunity to earn a position through his own merit?" Sophie's eyes widened with interest. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Victoria said, formulating the plan as she spoke, "what if we created a situation where your father could demonstrate his capabilities without knowing that you had anything to do with it? That way, when he succeeds, and I believe he will, he can take full credit for his achievement." "You would really do that?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria looked at the homemade resume spread across her desk, then at the remarkable child who had created it as an act of love for her father. In that moment, she made a decision that had nothing to do with corporate strategy and everything to do with recognizing exceptional people when they appeared in unexpected forms. "Sophie," she said, reaching for her phone, "I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm going to personally intervene in our hiring process because a very wise young lady convinced me that we've been making mistakes in how we evaluate candidates." Sophie's face lit up with joy so pure and radiant that Victoria felt her own eyes moisture with unexpected emotion. "Really? You'll give Daddy a chance?" "I'll give him the opportunity to prove himself," Victoria corrected gently. "The success will be entirely his own achievement." As Victoria began making phone calls to arrange what would become the most important interview of Marcus Williams's life, she reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had led to this moment. In 30 years of corporate leadership, she had never encountered someone with Sophie's combination of intelligence, courage, and devotion. This child had accomplished what seasoned executives struggled to achieve. She had identified a problem, developed a strategy, and executed a plan that would change the trajectory of her family's future. More importantly, Sophie had reminded Victoria of something she had perhaps forgotten in the years of corporate success, that the most valuable employees were often those who had been overlooked by conventional systems, and that sometimes the best business decisions were those guided by recognition of character rather than credentials. As she concluded her phone calls and began planning Marcus Williams's interview, Victoria smiled at the thought of what lay ahead. Sophie had asked for a chance for her father to prove himself, and Victoria intended to provide exactly that opportunity. But she suspected that the construction worker from the wrong side of town was about to surprise everyone, including himself, with just how much he had to offer Sterling Enterprises. The remarkable child who had orchestrated this meeting had seen her father's potential clearly, and Victoria was beginning to understand that Sophie Williams might be the most accurate judge of talent she had ever encountered. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Marcus was heating water for instant coffee, using the same tea bag for the third time to extract whatever flavor remained from the exhausted leaves. He almost didn't answer the unknown number, having grown tired of debt collectors and automated marketing calls. But something about the early hour suggested it might be different. "Mr. Williams? This is Patricia Chen from Sterling Enterprises Human Resources." The voice was professional but warm, carrying none of the dismissive tone he had grown accustomed to hearing from corporate representatives. "We'd like to schedule an interview with you for a position that's become available." Marcus felt his grip tighten on the phone, scarcely believing what he was hearing. "Sterling Enterprises? But I thought the woman at the job fair said I wasn't suitable for any positions." "Circumstances change, Mr. Williams," Patricia replied smoothly. "We've had a management review of several applications, and we'd like to meet with you to discuss opportunities that might be a better fit for your background. Would Thursday at 2:00 p.m. work for your schedule?" Management review. The phrase suggested a level of corporate attention that Marcus couldn't quite comprehend. In his experience, construction workers who were rejected at job fairs didn't receive callbacks from management, let alone personal phone calls from human resources directors. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "Thursday at 2:00 would be perfect. Should I? What position is this for exactly?" "We'll discuss the details during the interview," Patricia said. "Please bring identification and any documentation of your work experience. We'll meet in the main lobby, and someone will escort you to the appropriate conference room." After she hung up, Marcus stared at his phone for several minutes, wondering if he had imagined the entire conversation. Sterling Enterprises was calling him back. After weeks of rejections and mounting desperation, someone had reconsidered his application. The timing felt almost too fortunate, coming just days before their eviction deadline, and with his truck still impounded at Tommy's shop. "Daddy?" Sophie's voice came from the pull-out couch where she was getting dressed for school. "Was that good news?" Marcus turned to find his daughter watching him with the perceptive expression that never failed to amaze him. 8 years old, and she could read his emotions more accurately than most adults read facial expressions. "Maybe," he replied carefully, not wanting to build her hopes too high. "Sterling Enterprises wants to interview me again. Different person this time, different position." Sophie's face lit up with excitement that she quickly tried to contain, recognizing her father's cautious optimism. "That's wonderful, Daddy. What kind of job is it?" "They didn't say exactly," Marcus admitted. "Probably maintenance or security, something entry-level." Sophie nodded seriously, though Marcus noticed a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, an expression that suggested she knew something he didn't. But before he could question her about it, she had moved on to breakfast preparations, chattering about her upcoming spelling test and the library book she planned to finish during lunch. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Marcus spent hours at the public library, researching Sterling Enterprises' corporate culture and recent business developments. He practiced interview responses in their tiny bathroom mirror, trying to project confidence while battling the voice in his head that whispered about all the ways this opportunity could disappear as quickly as it had materialized. His preparation was complicated by the continuing deterioration of their circumstances. The eviction notice now had exactly 5 days remaining before enforcement. His truck sat at Tommy's shop, still requiring $1,400 in repairs he didn't have. Their rent was 3 months behind, and their food supplies had dwindled to a single box of pasta and a can of tomato sauce. Yet Marcus found himself nurturing a cautious hope that felt dangerous in its intensity. If Sterling Enterprises was calling him back, perhaps someone had recognized potential that other employers had missed. Perhaps his construction experience was more transferable than he had realized. Perhaps this interview would be the turning point their family desperately needed. On Thursday morning, Marcus woke before dawn, his body vibrating with nervous energy that made sleep impossible. He showered carefully, using the last of their good soap, and shaved with meticulous attention to detail. His interview outfit, the same white shirt and black slacks he had worn to the job fair, had been pressed and prepared the night before with the same methodical care he had once applied to construction projects. Sophie was unusually quiet during breakfast, picking at her cereal while stealing glances at her father. Marcus assumed her subdued mood reflected his own anxiety, but there was something in her expression that suggested deeper knowledge. "Daddy," she said as he prepared to leave for the interview, "whatever happens today, remember that you're special and anyone would be lucky to have you work for them." The statement was both touching and oddly specific, as though she was preparing him for something particular rather than offering general encouragement. Marcus knelt to hug her, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo and feeling the steady strength of her small arms around his neck. "I love you, sweetheart," he whispered. "Everything I do is for you." "I know, Daddy," she replied, holding him tighter than usual. "And everything is going to be okay. I promise." The bus ride downtown gave Marcus time to review his prepared responses one final time. He had memorized key talking points about his construction experience, emphasizing project management skills and safety record. He had practiced explaining his employment gap without sounding defensive. Most importantly, he had prepared to express genuine enthusiasm for any position Sterling Enterprises might offer, regardless of the starting level or salary. As the gleaming tower of Sterling Enterprises came into view, Marcus felt the familiar mixture of intimidation and determination that had characterized his job search. The building represented a world that had repeatedly rejected him, yet here he was, returning for a second chance that he still couldn't quite believe was real. The main lobby bustled with the same professional energy he remembered from his previous visit, but this time Marcus felt less like an intruder and more like someone who belonged, at least temporarily, in this space. He approached the reception desk with forced confidence. "Marcus Williams," he announced to the immaculately dressed receptionist, "I have a 2:00 appointment with Patricia Chen." The woman consulted her computer screen, then smiled with genuine warmth. "Of course, Mr. Williams, Miss Chen will be with you shortly. Please have a seat." Marcus settled into one of the lobby's leather chairs, trying to appear relaxed while his heart hammered against his ribs. Around him, Sterling Enterprises employees moved with purposeful efficiency, their conversations filled with references to quarterly projections and client meetings. He studied their faces, wondering if any of these confident professionals had ever felt the desperation that had driven him to this moment. "Mr. Williams," a woman in her 40s approached, extending her hand with professional courtesy. "I'm Patricia Chen. Thank you for coming in today." Marcus rose and shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested competence and authority. Patricia Chen was not the harried HR representative who had dismissed him at the job fair. This woman carried herself with the bearing of senior management. "Thank you for the opportunity," Marcus replied, falling into step beside her as she led him toward the elevator bank. "I have to admit, I was surprised to hear from Sterling Enterprises again. Sometimes, our initial screening processes miss exceptional candidates, Patricia said cryptically as they entered an elevator. Today's interview is designed to address that oversight. Marcus noticed that Patricia had pressed the button for the 41st floor far higher than he would have expected for an entry-level position interview. Most corporate interviews took place in conference rooms near the Human Resources Department, typically located on lower floors for easy access. The executive levels were reserved for senior management and board meetings, not conversations with prospective janitors or security guards. "Are we meeting in a conference room?" Marcus asked, trying to mask his confusion. "You could say that," Patricia replied with a slight smile that suggested she was enjoying some private knowledge. The interview location was specifically requested by the hiring manager. The elevator climbed smoothly toward the building's upper reaches, offering glimpses of the city through glass panels that revealed increasingly impressive views. Marcus had worked on buildings this tall, but always from the outside, installing windows and exterior systems. Being inside such a structure, rising toward its pinnacle, felt surreal and vaguely intimidating. When the elevator doors opened on the 41st floor, Marcus was struck by the obvious luxury of his surroundings. The hallway featured marble floors, original artwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the metropolitan area. This was clearly executive territory, designed to impress visitors and convey the power of those who worked here. "This way, please," Patricia said, leading him down a corridor lined with offices whose occupants were obviously senior management. Marcus caught glimpses of massive desks, expensive furnishings, and the kind of business discussions that shaped corporate strategy rather than daily operations. They stopped before a door marked with elegant lettering. "Victoria Sterling, Chief Executive Officer." Marcus felt his step falter as the implications hit him. "I think there's been a mistake," he said, his voice slightly hoarse with confusion. "I'm here about a maintenance position. This is the CEO's office." Patricia turned to face him with an expression that was both reassuring and mysterious. "There's no mistake, Mr. Williams. Miss Sterling specifically requested this meeting." Before Marcus could formulate a response, Patricia knocked gently on the door and opened it at the sound of a voice calling, "Come in." Marcus found himself being ushered into the most impressive office space he had ever seen, a room that was larger than his entire apartment, with windows offering views that stretched to the horizon. Behind an enormous mahogany desk sat a woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to assess him with immediate interest. Victoria Sterling rose as they entered, moving around her desk to greet him with unexpected warmth. "Mr. Williams," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Victoria Sterling. Thank you so much for coming in today." Marcus shook her hand automatically, his mind struggling to process the situation. "Miss Sterling, I'm honored to meet you, but I think there might be some confusion. I applied for an entry-level position, maintenance or security. I'm not sure why." "Please, have a seat." Victoria interrupted gently, gesturing toward a comfortable chair facing her desk. "Patricia, thank you for bringing Mr. Williams up. I'll take it from here." As Patricia left and closed the door behind her, Marcus found himself alone with one of the most powerful business leaders in the city, still bewildered about why he was there. Victoria settled behind her desk, studying him with an expression that seemed both professional and oddly personal. "Mr. Williams," she began, "before we discuss employment opportunities, I want to tell you about a remarkable young lady I met recently. A very intelligent 8-year-old who came to my office with a letter and an extraordinary handmade resume." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His confusion crystallized into horrifying understanding as Victoria continued speaking, but the sound of her voice became distant and muffled, overwhelmed by the rushing noise in his ears. "Sophie." His brilliant, determined, impossible daughter had somehow orchestrated this meeting. "Sophie was here?" he managed, his voice barely audible. "She was indeed," Victoria confirmed, her expression softening with obvious affection for his daughter. "She arrived during a tour group last Tuesday, then returned Thursday afternoon and managed to talk her way into my office." Quite an impressive feat of determination and strategic thinking. Marcus felt his face flush with a mixture of embarrassment, pride, and terror. I had no idea. She told me she was at the library after school. I'm so sorry, she shouldn't have bothered you. Children don't understand professional boundaries. Mr. Williams, Victoria interrupted, her tone firm but kind. Sophie didn't bother me. She opened my eyes to something I had been missing. Victoria reached into her desk drawer and withdrew 2 documents, Sophie's handwritten letter and the crayon-illustrated resume that Marcus had never seen. As she spread them across her desk, Marcus felt his throat constrict with emotion. The love and care evident in every line, every carefully chosen word, every colorful drawing, overwhelmed him completely. Did you know, Victoria asked gently, that your daughter has been researching Sterling Enterprises for weeks? She read articles about my background, studied our corporate culture, and identified strategic parallels between my childhood and your current circumstances. Marcus stared at the documents, unable to speak. The resume showed him through Sophie's eyes not as a desperate man begging for work, but as a capable professional with valuable skills and admirable character. She had taken the failures and rejections that haunted his self-image and reframed them as evidence of his persistence and integrity. She believes in you completely, Victoria continued, watching Marcus struggle with his emotions. But more than that, she made me believe in you too. This letter and resume are the most compelling employment documents I've seen in 30 years of business. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out rough and unsteady. She's incredible, smarter than I ever was or ever will be. But Miss Sterling, I appreciate what you're doing, but I can't accept charity. If you're offering me a job because you feel sorry for us. Stop, Victoria said, her tone sharp enough to cut through his protests. Mr. Williams, do you think I built a multi-billion-dollar corporation by making emotional hiring decisions? Do you think I maintain my position as CEO by offering jobs to people I feel sorry for? The directness of her challenge forced Marcus to meet her eyes, where he saw not pity but the steely determination of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions based on business merit rather than sentiment. Sophie didn't ask me to feel sorry for you, Victoria continued. She asked me to see your potential, and once I looked past the conventional screening criteria that had led to your rejection, I realized she was absolutely right. Victoria stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the city spread below them. Mr. Williams, may I tell you about my own background? Marcus nodded, still processing the surreal nature of this conversation. I was born Victoria Martinez, she began, her voice taking on a reflective quality. My mother was a single parent who worked 3 jobs to keep us fed and housed. When I was 9, just a year older than Sophie is now, my mother died in an industrial accident. I was sent to live with my grandmother, who spoke limited English and cleaned office buildings for a living. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he recognized elements of his own story in her narrative. I was brilliant in school, Victoria continued, but my circumstances made me invisible to the guidance counselors and teachers who might have helped me plan for college. I wore second-hand clothes, lived in the wrong neighborhood, and carried the stigma of poverty wherever I went. When I applied for jobs during high school, employers took one look at my address and decided I wasn't suitable for their establishments. The parallel to his recent experiences was so exact that Marcus wondered if Victoria had deliberately chosen these words to emphasize their shared understanding. But I had one advantage, Victoria said, turning back to face him. I had my grandmother, who believed in me completely and never let me doubt my own worth. She saw my potential when everyone else saw only my limitations. Marcus understood immediately. Sophie. Exactly, Victoria confirmed. Your daughter sees you the way my grandmother saw Minot, as someone defined by current circumstances, but as someone capable of extraordinary achievement given the right opportunity. Victoria returned to her desk and sat down, her expression becoming more businesslike. Mr. Williams, I didn't call you here to offer you charity. I called you here to offer you a position that makes sense for someone with your background and capabilities. Marcus felt his pulse accelerate with renewed hope and terror. What kind of position? Assistant Director of Facilities Management, Victoria replied without hesitation. You would oversee maintenance operations for our corporate headquarters and 3 satellite offices. The position includes a starting salary of $85,000, full health benefits for you and Sophie, and a $10,000 signing bonus to help you address immediate financial needs. The numbers hit Marcus like a series of physical blows. $85,000 was more than he had ever earned in construction, even during his best years. The signing bonus alone would cover their rent, retrieve his truck, and provide financial stability he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. I don't understand, Marcus said weakly. Facilities management requires experience I don't have. I've never managed corporate operations. You've managed construction projects, Victoria pointed out. You've coordinated subcontractors, managed budgets, ensured compliance with safety regulations, and delivered results on schedule. Those are exactly the skills required for facilities management. Marcus shook his head, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what he was hearing. But why? Why would you take such a risk on someone you've never worked with? Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying him with the same analytical intensity she probably brought to major business decisions. Because 30 years ago, someone took a risk on a young woman with no corporate experience, no connections, and no qualifications except intelligence and determination. That decision changed my life and ultimately built this company. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. More importantly, because your daughter convinced me that you possess qualities that are far more valuable than traditional qualifications. Integrity, persistence, problem-solving ability, and the kind of character that makes someone trustworthy with important responsibilities. Marcus felt tears burning behind his eyes as the reality of the offer began to penetrate his disbelief. This wasn't charity or pity, it was recognition of potential. He had almost stopped believing in himself. Mr. Williams, Victoria said gently, your daughter climbed 41 floors to tell me that you deserved a chance to prove yourself. Are you going to make her a liar? The challenge was delivered with a slight smile, but Marcus heard the serious question underneath. Sophie had risked everything, her safety, his reputation, their relationship to create this opportunity. Refusing it would invalidate not just her faith in him, but her remarkable courage in advocating for their family. No, ma'am, Marcus replied, his voice stronger than it had been in months. I won't make her a liar. Victoria smiled and reached for her phone. Patricia? Please prepare the employment documentation for Marcus Williams, Assistant Director of Facilities Management. Standard benefits package, plus the signing bonus we discussed. He'll be starting Monday. As she hung up, Victoria looked at Marcus with an expression that combined professional satisfaction with personal warmth. Welcome to Sterling Enterprises, Mr. Williams. I have a feeling you're going to exceed everyone's expectations. Marcus sat in silence for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. Then, thinking of Sophie waiting at home for news of his interview, he felt a smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile he had experienced in months. Ms. Sterling, he said, I promise you won't regret this decision. I already know I won't, Victoria replied with complete confidence. Your daughter made sure of that. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their new apartment, casting geometric patterns across the hardwood floors that Sophie had spent weeks calculating and sketching in her notebook. At 9 years old, she had developed an appreciation for natural light that bordered on scientific, measuring the angles at different times of day and determining the optimal placement for her desk to maximize studying conditions. Marcus stood in the doorway of what was now Sophie's bedroom, her own space for the first time in her life, watching his daughter arrange her books with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. The room was modest by Sterling Enterprises' executive standards, but to Marcus it represented a luxury beyond his wildest imagination 6 months ago. Privacy, space, and the simple dignity of a child having her own sanctuary. "Ready for breakfast, sweetheart?" he called, marveling at how natural the words felt, now that they didn't carry the underlying anxiety about whether they actually had food to serve. 2 more minutes, Daddy." Sophie replied without looking up from her organizational project. I'm arranging my mathematics books by complexity level so I can access them more efficiently when I'm working on advanced problems. Marcus smiled, remembering when such statements from his daughter had worried him, a child whose intellectual gifts set her apart from her peers, isolated by circumstances that prevented her from accessing appropriate educational resources. Now, enrolled in the Whitman Academy for Gifted Students, Sophie moved through her days surrounded by teachers and classmates who not only understood her abilities but challenged her to develop them further. The kitchen in their new apartment was 3 times the size of their old living space, complete with modern appliances that still amazed Marcus with their efficiency and reliability. As he prepared Sophie's breakfast, fresh fruit, whole grain cereal, and orange juice that wasn't reconstituted from powder reflected on how profoundly their circumstances had changed. 6 months as Assistant Director of Facilities Management at Sterling Enterprises had transformed not just their financial situation but Marcus's understanding of his own capabilities. The position had required him to coordinate maintenance operations across 4 corporate locations, manage a team of 37 employees, and oversee annual budgets that exceeded what he had previously earned in a decade of construction work. Initially, the transition had been overwhelming. Corporate protocols, administrative systems, and management responsibilities were foreign concepts that required intensive learning and adaptation. But Victoria Sterling had been right about the transferable skills. Project management, team coordination, and problem-solving abilities translated surprisingly well from construction sites to corporate environments. More importantly, Marcus had discovered leadership qualities he hadn't known he possessed. His background in construction, rather than being a limitation, had provided credibility with the maintenance staff and practical knowledge that proved invaluable in managing complex building systems. The respect he had earned through competence and fairness had gradually built into genuine authority. "Daddy," Sophie announced, entering the kitchen with her backpack perfectly organized and her school uniform impeccably arranged. "Mrs. Patterson called yesterday while you were in your meeting with the building engineers. She wanted to know if we could visit her this afternoon. She said she has something important to discuss with us." Mrs. Patterson had remained a constant presence in their lives, even after their financial circumstances improved. The elderly woman had become surrogate grandmother to Sophie and trusted advisor to Marcus, offering wisdom and perspective that helped them navigate their dramatically changed situation with grace and humility. "Of course we can visit," Marcus replied, spreading peanut butter on Sophie's toast with the careful attention he had once reserved for measuring construction materials. "Did she say what she wanted to discuss?" "She mentioned something about the community center needing help with their job placement program," Sophie said, accepting her breakfast with a smile that never failed to light up Marcus's day. "I think she wants to ask if you'd be willing to volunteer." The suggestion didn't surprise Marcus. Over the past few months, he had felt a growing desire to give back to the community that had supported them during their darkest period. Success had brought not just financial security, but a sense of responsibility to help others who faced the same obstacles he had overcome. After dropping Sophie at school, a routine that now involved a brief drive through tree-lined streets rather than anxious calculations about bus schedules and safety concerns, Marcus headed to Sterling Enterprises headquarters. The building that had once intimidated him with its corporate grandeur now felt like a second home, a place where his contributions were valued and his opinions sought. "Good morning, Mr. Williams," called Jennifer from the reception desk, using the respectful tone that had replaced the dismissive efficiency he remembered from his first job fair experience. "Miss Sterling wanted to see you in her office when you arrived. Something about the quarterly maintenance review." Marcus nodded and headed toward the executive elevators, still occasionally amazed by his casual access to areas of the building that had once seemed impossibly exclusive. His relationship with Victoria Sterling had evolved from grateful employee to trusted colleague, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to overcome systemic obstacles through determination and opportunity. Victoria's office remained as impressive as during his first visit, But Marcus now noticed details that had escaped him during that overwhelming initial encounter. The photographs of scholarship recipients from her foundation, the books on leadership and social justice, the small, succulent garden that suggested someone who nurtured growth in unexpected places. "Marcus," Victoria greeted him warmly, looking up from a report that bore his signature at the bottom. "I've been reviewing your quarterly analysis of our energy efficiency improvements. The cost savings you've identified through systematic maintenance protocols are remarkable." Marcus felt the familiar surge of pride that accompanied professional recognition, a sensation that had been absent from his life for so long that he was still learning to accept it gracefully. "Thank you, Miss Sterling. The improvements were really team efforts. Once we identified the inefficiencies, the maintenance staff was eager to implement solutions." "Modest as always," Victoria observed with amusement. "But I didn't call you here just to discuss operational successes. I have a proposition that I think might interest you." She gestured toward the chair where Marcus had first learned about Sophie's extraordinary intervention, and he settled into it with the comfortable familiarity of someone who belonged in such spaces. "The Sterling Foundation is expanding our job placement initiatives," Victoria continued, "and we're looking for someone to develop programs specifically focused on helping skilled workers transition into corporate environments. Based on your own experience and your success here, I believe you'd be uniquely qualified to design and lead such programs." The offer represented another significant step forward from facilities management to program development, from maintaining buildings to changing lives. Marcus felt the same mixture of excitement and trepidation that had characterized his initial interview, but now tempered by confidence earned through months of proven performance. "I'm honored by your confidence in me," Marcus replied. "But I'd want to ensure that any program I developed would actually reach the people who need it, not just those who already have the resources to access traditional job placement services." Victoria smiled, recognizing the social consciousness that had attracted her to Marcus in the first place. "That's exactly why you're the right person for this position. You understand the barriers that prevent capable people from accessing opportunities, because you've experienced those barriers yourself." That afternoon, Marcus and Sophie visited Mrs. Patterson in her modest apartment, where the elderly woman served tea and homemade cookies while discussing her volunteer work at the downtown community center. The center, she explained, had received funding to expand their job placement services, but lacked staff with relevant experience to develop effective programs. "They need someone who understands both sides," Mrs. Patterson said, studying Marcus with the perceptive eyes that had immediately recognized his character months earlier. "Someone who knows what it feels like to be rejected and overlooked, but who also understands what employers are really looking for." Sophie listened intently to the conversation, occasionally asking questions that revealed her remarkable grasp of complex social and economic issues. At 9, she possessed insight into systemic inequality that many adults never developed, perhaps because she had experienced its effects firsthand. "Daddy could help lots of people," Sophie observed when Mrs. Patterson finished explaining the community center's needs. "He knows how to see the good things about people that other people might miss." The simple statement captured something essential about Marcus's transformation over the past 6 months. Success had given him not just financial security, but perspective on his own abilities and the arbitrary nature of many hiring decisions. He had learned to recognize potential in others, the way Victoria Sterling had recognized it in him. The following Saturday morning, Marcus found himself standing in the community center's main hall, surrounded by dozens of job seekers, whose expressions of desperate hope reminded him painfully of his own experience just months earlier. The diversity of the crowd was striking: former military personnel, displaced factory workers, single parents, recent immigrants, all united by economic necessity and diminishing confidence in their own worth. Sophie had insisted on accompanying him despite his concerns about exposing her to such raw desperation. But she moved through the crowd with remarkable maturity, offering encouragement to other children whose parents had brought them along, and helping distribute informational materials with the efficiency of someone twice her age. "Before we begin," Marcus announced to the assembled group, I want you to know that 6 months ago, I was sitting exactly where you are now. Unemployed, behind on rent, wondering if anyone would ever give me a chance to prove what I could do." A murmur of recognition rippled through the crowd as people realized they were hearing from someone who truly understood their circumstances rather than a well-meaning professional who had never experienced unemployment. Rejection. "I'm not here to tell you that finding work is easy," Marcus continued, "or that positive thinking will solve systemic problems. But I am here to tell you that your worth as a person and as a worker isn't determined by how many times you've been rejected or how long you've been unemployed." Over the next 3 hours, Marcus worked with individual job seekers, reviewing resumes, conducting practice interviews, and helping people identify transferable skills they hadn't recognized in themselves. The process required patience and empathy, as many participants had internalized years of rejection and needed encouragement before they could present themselves effectively. "Mr. Johnson," Marcus said to a former assembly line worker who had been unemployed for 8 months, "you've described your factory experience as just following instructions. But what you've actually told me about is quality control, process improvement, and team coordination. Those are management skills." He watched as understanding dawned in the older man's eyes, the recognition that his experience had value beyond the narrow context in which he had previously viewed it. Similar moments of revelation occurred throughout the day, as Marcus helped people reframe their backgrounds and articulate their capabilities more effectively. Sophie spent the day observing these interactions with fascination, occasionally offering insights that surprised the adults around her. During a break, she approached Marcus with the serious expression that usually preceded her most important observations. "Daddy," she said quietly, "these people have the same problem you had. They think there's something wrong with them, but really, there's something wrong with the system that can't see how valuable they are." The insight was both profound and heartbreaking, a 9-year-old's clear-eyed analysis of structural inequality that many economists and sociologists struggled to articulate as effectively. Marcus realized that Sophie's intellectual gifts extended far beyond mathematics and reading comprehension to include social awareness and emotional intelligence that would serve her well throughout her life. As the day wound down and participants began leaving with renewed hope and practical strategies, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his role had shifted. 6 months ago, he had been the desperate job seeker, grateful for any opportunity. Now he was the one providing opportunities, using his platform at Sterling Enterprises and his personal experience to open doors for others. The transformation felt both surreal and inevitable, as though Sophie's intervention had set in motion a series of events that extended far beyond their individual circumstances. Her courage in approaching Victoria Sterling had not only changed their lives, but had positioned Marcus to impact the lives of countless others facing similar struggles. "Daddy," Sophie said, as they prepared to leave the community center, "I'm proud of how you helped all those people today. But I'm not surprised." Marcus looked down at his daughter, still amazed by her ability to see the best in people and situations. "Why aren't you surprised, sweetheart?" "Because you've always been special," Sophie replied with the matter-of-fact tone she used for stating obvious truths. "The only thing that changed is that now other people can see it too." That evening, as Marcus tucked Sophie into her own bed in her own room, he found himself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. A desperate child's love for her father had created opportunities that seemed impossible just months earlier. Sophie's refusal to accept his limitations had forced him to recognize his own potential. "Sophie," he said, as she settled under covers that no longer carried the anxiety of uncertain tomorrows, "do you remember what you told me the morning of my interview at Sterling? You said everything was going to be okay, and that you promised." Sophie nodded, her dark eyes serious in the soft lamplight. "I remember." "How did you know?" Marcus asked. "How could you be so certain when everything seemed hopeless?" Sophie considered the question with the same careful attention she brought to complex mathematical problems. "Because I knew you," she finally answered. "I knew you were good and smart and strong, and I knew that if the right person could see you the way I see you, they would want you to work for them." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he understood the full implications of his daughter's faith. She hadn't been naive or unrealistic in her optimism. She had been strategic, recognizing that the problem wasn't his lack of qualifications, but the system's inability to recognize unconventional excellence. "And Miss Sterling was the right person?" he asked. "Miss Sterling was someone who had been overlooked too," Sophie explained. "She knew what it felt like to be judged by the wrong things, so she could see past those things to what really mattered." The analysis revealed Sophie's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics skills that had enabled her to identify and approach exactly the right person to advocate for her father. Her success hadn't been luck or childhood innocence, but careful research and strategic thinking. As Marcus turned off the light and headed toward his own bedroom, a space that was his alone for the first time since Sarah's death, he reflected on the profound truth Sophie had articulated. Sometimes, the smallest voices carried the most power, not because they were loud or demanding, but because they spoke with the clarity of love, uncomplicated by adult cynicism. 6 months later, Marcus Williams stood in the Sterling Foundation's new job placement center, watching as former construction workers, displaced retail employees, and struggling single parents worked with counselors to develop career strategies. The program he had designed was exceeding all expectations, with placement rates that outperformed traditional employment services by significant margins. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the program's most important impact: the restoration of dignity and hope to people who had been systematically overlooked by conventional hiring practices. Marcus saw himself reflected in every participant who discovered hidden strengths and untapped potential through the process. Victoria Sterling approached him as he reviewed the monthly statistics, her expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone whose investment in unconventional talent had been thoroughly validated. "The board is extremely pleased with these results," she said, gesturing toward the report in Marcus's hands. "They've approved expansion to 3 additional cities, with you overseeing the entire initiative." The promotion represented another milestone in Marcus's improbable journey from desperate job seeker to senior program director. But more than personal advancement, it meant the opportunity to impact hundreds of additional families facing the same struggles he and Sophie had endured. "I accept," Marcus replied without hesitation. "On one condition." Victoria raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his confident negotiation. "What condition?" "I want Sophie involved in the program design," Marcus said, gesturing toward his daughter, who was currently helping a participant's child with homework in the center's family area. "She understands things about hope and potential that most adults have forgotten." Victoria followed his gaze to where Sophie sat with a younger child, patiently explaining mathematical concepts with the same clarity and encouragement she had brought to advocating for her father. The scene embodied everything the program was meant to achieve: the transfer of knowledge, hope, and possibility from those who had found success to those still searching for opportunity. "Agreed," Victoria said with a smile. "After all, she's the one who taught us to look beyond conventional qualifications in the first place." As the day ended and Marcus and Sophie prepared to return to their beautiful apartment in their safe neighborhood, where Sophie could attend an excellent school and pursue her extraordinary potential without limitation, Marcus found himself thinking about the simple truth that had started their transformation. A child's love, expressed through courage and determination, had opened doors that no amount of traditional qualification could have unlocked. Sophie's refusal to accept his circumstances as permanent had forced him to recognize his own worth and fight for the recognition he deserved. "Daddy," Sophie said as they walked toward their car paid for in full, another symbol of their changed circumstances. "Mrs. Rodriguez wants to nominate me for the state mathematics competition. Is that okay with you?" Marcus smiled, remembering when Sophie's intellectual gifts had worried him because they seemed impossible to nurture given their financial constraints. Now her abilities were assets to be celebrated and developed rather than hidden talents that might never find expression. "Of course it's okay," he replied. "You should pursue every opportunity that interests you." "Good," Sophie said with satisfaction. Because I want to study economics and social policy when I'm older. I want to understand why systems sometimes prevent good people from succeeding, and figure out how to fix those systems. The ambition was both inspiring and logical. Sophie had experienced firsthand the arbitrary nature of many social and economic barriers, and her analytical mind naturally gravitated toward solving complex systemic problems. As they drove through the city toward their home, Marcus reflected on the profound lesson his daughter had taught him. Success wasn't just about individual achievement, but about recognizing that everyone possessed potential that deserved opportunity for expression. Sophie had seen that truth clearly when he had lost sight of it himself, and her faith had created possibilities that extended far beyond their own family. The smallest voice had indeed carried the most power, not because it demanded attention, but because it spoke with the clarity of love that refused to accept limitations others tried to impose. In saving her father, Sophie had learned to save others, and in the process had discovered that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to let good people believe they are not good enough. Marcus Williams, Assistant Director of Strategic Programs for the Sterling Foundation, driver of a reliable car, father to a gifted daughter pursuing unlimited possibilities, understood finally that his transformation had begun not with Victoria Sterling's recognition, but with Sophie's unwavering belief that he deserved better than the world seemed willing to offer. And as they pulled into the driveway of their apartment complex, safe, clean, and filled with families who had found their way to stability, Marcus knew that the most important door Sophie had opened was the one that led him back to believing in himself.